It begins with the sea, waves crashing against the cliffs of a small island in the far northwest of Europe, a place of fog and storms, green fields and rivers, villages and towns clustered under grey skies. No one in the 15th century could have imagined that this island, smaller than France, poorer than Spain, and constantly torn by war, would one day rule over a quarter of the world. Yet this is the story of the British Empire, the story of how a kingdom that seemed fragile and small built power greater than any empire before it, and how, in time, it lost everything it had gained. For many centuries, Britain was not special. The land was fertile, but not the richest in Europe. Its armies were brave, but not the strongest. Its rulers often fought among themselves, and enemies on the continent mocked its weakness. To survive, the island kingdom depended on the sea, and it was on that sea, with ships that grew faster and stronger, that the dream of empire began. The empire's rise was not planned. It came from chance, ambition, rivalry, and hunger. Merchants, sailors, and kings sought wealth and safety, and in doing so, they created something far larger than themselves. Imagine the world 400 years ago. Vast oceans still uncharted, continents still unknown to Europeans, and riches waiting in spices, gold, and land. Spain and Portugal had already begun their race across the seas, seizing the Americas and routes to Asia. France and the Dutch followed. England at first seemed late to the race, but what it lacked in early wealth, it made up for with stubborn will, daring sailors, and an island spirit that refused to bow to rivals. This is a story of victories and defeats, of bold dreams and bitter mistakes. The British Empire rose not because of one great moment, but because of many. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 gave confidence that the island could protect itself. Colonies in America and the Caribbean gave sugar and tobacco. The East India Company, beginning as a trader, became a ruler. Wars against France gave Britain dominance over the seas. The Industrial Revolution filled its ships and factories with power. At its height, the empire stretched across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific. People said the sun never set on its lands because somewhere, at every hour, British flags flew above towns and ports. But every empire carries its weakness within. The British Empire was no different. Its power came from trade, yet greed in trade caused cruelty. Its rulers spoke of law and civilization, yet they allowed slavery and famine. Its armies won wars, yet each victory created enemies. Its colonies gave wealth, yet they longed for freedom. The very size of the empire made it impossible to hold forever. In this story, we will not only see how the British Empire rose and fell, we will also meet the people inside it. The rulers who dreamed of greatness, the leaders who built with vision, and the ones whose mistakes cost dearly. We will see who gave strength to the empire and who brought it weakness. And at the end, we will ask, if such an empire still existed today, what would it look like? Would it be a giant of trade and culture, or would it collapse under the same divisions that once destroyed it? The rise and fall of the British Empire is not just the story of Britain. It is the story of the modern world. The borders it drew still shape nations. The languages it spread still live in schools and offices. The trade it built still connects seas and markets. Its legacy is not only in palaces and parliaments, but in the everyday lives of billions. To understand its story is to understand how our world became what it is today. Close your eyes and picture a map of the world. Around the year 1900, a quarter of it is red, the colour used for British lands. From Canada to India, from Egypt to Australia, from South Africa to Hong Kong, the empire stretched like no other. For those who lived in London, it seemed eternal. For those in colonies, it was both a source of order and of oppression. For some it meant opportunity, for others suffering. This double face, glory and grief, is what made the British Empire one of the most powerful and controversial stories in history. As we begin this long journey, remember that empires are not only made of kings and generals, they are also built by ordinary people. Sailors who crossed oceans, farmers who worked plantations, traders who filled ships, and soldiers who marched across deserts and jungles. Their voices are not always heard in grand histories, but they are part of the true story. This is not a tale of dates alone. It is a saga of power, of human ambition, and of the fragile balance between building and destroying. The British Empire teaches us that greatness is never permanent, that mistakes carry heavy costs, and that every rise carries within it the seed of fall. So let us begin. From the shores of a small island kingdom, We will follow the ships that sailed into unknown seas, the armies that marched into faraway lands, and the rulers who dreamed of an empire that would last forever. And then we will see how, step by step, century by century, that empire unraveled, leaving behind memories, scars, and lessons that still echo in our world. This is the rise and fall of the British Empire, how they built power, and how they lost it. Before Britain became an empire, it was only an island kingdom, often fragile, often uncertain of its place in the world. To understand how it later ruled distant lands, we must first see what life was like when its power was still small. This is the story of a people who were once under threat themselves, a people who fought simply to survive, long before they dreamed of ruling others. England in the Middle Ages was no superpower. Its fields gave wheat and barley, its rivers gave fish, and its forests gave wood for homes and ships. But it had little gold, little silver, and little wealth compared to neighbours on the continent. France was larger, richer, and stronger. Spain had more lands and resources. The kingdoms of Central Europe, the Italian states, even the far-off Ottomans, all seemed greater. For England, survival meant keeping enemies away, guarding its borders, and praying for harvests to last through winters. The island's geography shaped its fate. Surrounded by seas, England was safe from constant invasion, but also cut off from much of Europe. The English Channel acted as both shield and barrier. When wars came, they often came by sea. Viking raids in earlier centuries had scarred the coasts. The Norman conquest of 1066 had shown that foreign armies could still land. For centuries afterward, English rulers lived with the memory of defeat and the fear that it might happen again. Rivalry with France became the defining struggle of medieval England. The 100 Years' War in the 14th and 15th centuries drained treasure and lives. English armies sometimes triumphed, as at Agincourt under Henry V, but in the end, they lost their lands in France. These defeats humbled England. It was not the master of Europe. It was a nation wounded, forced to look inward. Civil wars known as the Wars of the Roses followed, tearing the kingdom apart in bloody battles between rival houses. By the time the Tudors came to power in the late 15th century, England was a land tired of war, poor in wealth, and uncertain about the future. Religion too played its part in shaping the kingdom's fate. The English Reformation in the 16th century broke ties with the Catholic Church. Henry therefore made himself head of the Church of England, not the Pope in Rome. This gave the crown more control, but it also created enemies abroad. Catholic Spain and France now saw England as a heretic land, dangerous and rebellious. Religious conflict threatened to weaken the island even further, yet these very struggles planted the seeds of empire. Being small, England learned to be resourceful. Being poor, it sought wealth in trade. Being threatened, it turned to the sea for safety. The island's weakness became its strength. While great continental armies marched across Europe, England built ships. While other kingdoms looked inward, England looked outward, to horizons across the ocean. Life for ordinary people was hard. Most lived as farmers, tied to land, struggling to feed families. Winters were cold, summers uncertain. Plague had killed millions in earlier centuries, leaving villages empty. Cities were crowded, dirty, and noisy. Yet in the midst of hardship, a spirit of endurance grew. Stories, songs, and faith gave people hope. Sailors, merchants, and adventurers began to dream of more than survival. They dreamed of seas beyond the horizon. The monarchy, too, learned lessons from weakness. Rulers like Henry VII and Henry VIII realized that to protect the kingdom, they needed strong control at home. They reformed laws, strengthened administration, and tightened the crown's grip on nobility. This created a government more stable than in many parts of Europe. That stability would later help when the kingdom looked outward to build colonies and trade routes. It is important to remember that in this time, empire was not yet the goal. England did not plan to conquer the world. It only sought safety and survival. It wanted trade to bring wealth, alliances to bring strength, and faith to give unity. But survival has a way of pushing nations into ambition. To defend themselves, the English would soon begin building ships to explore, to trade, and eventually to conquer. Looking back, the island kingdom before empire seems small, vulnerable, even weak. But inside that weakness lay determination. Its people knew fear, but they also knew resilience. Its rulers lost battles, but they also learned from defeat. Its seas kept enemies out, but they also opened doors to distant lands. The empire that would one day rule across continents was born not in glory, but in struggle. The British Empire began as a dream on a small island, a dream shaped by poverty, rivalry, and survival. That dream would grow, carried by ships and sailors, until it covered the world. But before it rose, it was only this, a fragile kingdom clinging to its shores, looking out at the endless sea, wondering what future lay beyond the horizon. The dream of empire often begins quietly, not with grand armies or crowns of gold, but with ships rocking in harbours and sailors staring out to sea. For England, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the seeds of expansion were planted not by kings alone, but by merchants, adventurers, and explorers who dared to push beyond the horizon. The island kingdom, small and often troubled, began to look outward. What they found beyond the seas would change their destiny forever. The oceans were still mysteries. Vast stretches of water, filled with storms and hidden currents, seemed endless to those who dared to sail them. Spain and Portugal had already begun to master this world. They discovered new lands, claimed rich colonies, and filled their treasuries with gold and silver from the Americas. To many in England, it seemed they had arrived too late to the race. But envy has its own power. Watching rivals grow rich and strong stirred both fear and ambition in English hearts. If others could cross oceans and claim wealth, why not them? The first English attempts were cautious. Merchants and adventurers financed voyages, often with the crown's blessing, but little real support. John Cabot, an Italian sailing under the English flag, set out in 1497 and reached the coasts of Newfoundland. His journey showed that English ships could reach the New World, though they lacked the resources to hold it. Still, this small success planted a seed. England could, if it dared, step into the game of global discovery. At home, the sea shaped life. Fishermen sailed far into the Atlantic for cod and herring. Merchants traded wool and cloth with Europe, and shipbuilders honed their craft in coastal towns. Each harbour, each dockyard, became a workshop of empire before the empire even existed. For ordinary English families, the sea meant food, work, and hope. For rulers, it meant protection and possibility. As the 16th century unfolded, the island's relationship with the sea deepened, becoming not just a shield, but a highway to opportunity. Religion, too, played its part. The Protestant Reformation, which divided Europe, pushed England further into rivalry with Catholic Spain. Battles over faith spilled into battles over seas. If Spain could spread Catholic power through conquest, England could answer by building its own routes, its own colonies, its own trade. Faith gave moral fuel to ambition, convincing sailors and rulers alike that they were part of a struggle larger than themselves. Ships grew stronger, faster, and more daring. Navigation improved, maps grew more detailed, and compasses pointed the way. English sailors, inspired by tales of wealth and adventure, sought patrons to fund their journeys. Merchants pooled money, sharing both risk and reward. This system, small at first, would become the backbone of English overseas ventures. Where a king's treasury was too poor to fund empire, the combined wealth of merchants filled the gap. Profit and power walked hand in hand. The seas also offered a new kind of war. English sea dogs, as they came to be called, turned piracy into politics. They raided Spanish treasure fleets, bringing home silver and gold while weakening England's enemies. Men like Francis Drake and John Hawkins became heroes at home, villains abroad. Their daring voyages made England's name known on distant shores. Though still weaker than Spain, England showed it could strike hard and far. These early raids did more than enrich pockets. They taught English sailors the routes of oceans, the winds of the Caribbean, and the secrets of Spanish colonies. In learning how to steal, they also learned how to rule. Back in England, life remained uncertain. The Wars of the Roses had ended, but the kingdom was still not wealthy. Farms struggled, towns grew slowly, and poverty touched many families. But overseas, the promise of land, gold, and trade seemed endless. Stories returned of fertile fields, exotic spices, and treasures beyond imagination. These stories stirred both nobles and commoners. Colonies became more than a dream of power. They became a dream of escape, of a better life. For those with little at home, the seas whispered of new beginnings. The crown too began to see the value of expansion. A monarch's power was tied to wealth, and wealth increasingly came from trade. By granting charters to companies and explorers, the crown encouraged expansion while spending little itself. The system worked. Risk lay with merchants, glory with the crown. Over time, this partnership would create institutions like the East India Company, blending private ambition with national power in ways no rival could match. It is easy now to see the British Empire as inevitable, as if it was destined to rise. But at this stage, nothing was certain. England was still a small island facing giants. Spain's treasure fleets seemed unstoppable, France was a constant rival, and the Dutch were growing rich from trade. England had no standing army to match them, no great riches to spend, and no colonies to boast of. All it had was the sea, a restless spirit, and the daring of those willing to risk everything on voyages that might end in glory or in death. And yet, from these fragile beginnings, the seeds of empire took root. A few ships became many, small raids became organized ventures, trade routes once borrowed from rivals became England's own. Each journey across the ocean widened the island's vision. No longer trapped between France and the North Sea, England began to see itself as something greater, a nation that could stretch beyond its shores, a nation whose fate was tied not just to Europe, but to the whole world. Looking back, the seeds of expansion seem humble, a fisherman's catch, a pirate's raid, a merchant's gamble, but these small acts carried the weight of history. They turned a kingdom of survival into a kingdom of ambition. They set in motion the voyages, the wars and the empires that would define centuries. The sea called, and England answered. The seeds were planted. Soon, they would grow into something the world had never seen before. The 16th century gave England a queen whose reign marked a turning point not only for her kingdom, but for the empire that would come. Elizabeth II, daughter of Henry VIII, ruled from 1558 to 1603, and in those 45 years, the English spirit of exploration and defiance against greater powers took root. Her court was alive with ambition, poetry and politics, but her reign was also one of danger. Enemies abroad, plots at home, and the struggle for survival shaped every choice she made. Yet, it was in this crucible of challenge that England began to step forward onto the world stage. Elizabeth inherited a troubled throne. Religious conflict tore at the nation. Her father had broken with Rome. Her sister Mary had burned Protestants. And now Elizabeth sought to calm the storm by walking a careful line. But her Protestant identity meant that Catholic Europe, especially Spain, viewed her with suspicion and hostility. Spain was the greatest power of the age, rich with gold from the Americas, armed with mighty fleets and backed by the Pope himself. For Elizabeth, survival meant preparing to resist Spanish might, even while her resources were far less. The sea became her weapon. While Spain sent treasure fleets across the Atlantic, Elizabeth gave quiet support to sailors who attacked them. Men like Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher became known as sea dogs, part privateer, part pirate, and all adventurer. They raided Spanish ports, seized gold and silver, and returned home as heroes. Officially, Elizabeth often denied their actions. Unofficially, she knighted Drake on the deck of his ship after he circumnavigated the globe. These men were more than thieves. They were training a generation of sailors who would learn the seas better than any rivals. Francis Drake became the most famous of them all. His voyage around the world from 1577 to 1580 was not only a daring adventure, but also a declaration that English ships could match Spain's anywhere. He captured treasure ships, mapped unknown coasts, and returned with wealth beyond imagination. His very survival proved that English seamanship could rival the great powers. When he returned to London, crowds cheered, and Elizabeth embraced him as a symbol of the nation's courage. Yet the struggle with Spain could not remain limited to raids. Tension grew year after year. Elizabeth's support for Dutch rebels against Spanish rule, her approval of attacks on Spanish treasure, and her Protestant stance pushed relations toward war. King Philip II of Spain, determined to end England's defiance, prepared an invasion. In 1588, he sent the Spanish Armada, a fleet of over 130 ships, to cross the Channel, link with forces in the Netherlands, and crush Elizabeth's kingdom. It was the greatest threat England had faced in centuries. The Armada seemed unstoppable, vast, well-armed and backed by Spain's wealth. Yet the English fought with skill, speed and a touch of luck. Using smaller, more maneuverable ships, they harassed the Spanish line, setting fireships loose in the night to scatter enemy formations. The seas and storms also played their part, battering Spanish vessels along the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. In the end, the Armada retreated in ruin, its ships broken, its mission failed. For England, this was more than a victory. It was a moment of destiny. A small island had stood against the mightiest empire in the world and prevailed. Elizabeth's speech to her troops at Tilbury became legendary. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Her words, her courage, and the triumph against Spain gave the English people a new sense of pride. They were no longer merely survivors on the edge of Europe. They were a nation that could defy giants. The Armada's defeat did not destroy Spain's power, but it shifted the balance. England gained confidence, and its sailors gained freedom to push further across the seas. Colonization began in earnest. Walter Raleigh attempted settlements in North America, planting the seeds for what would later become Virginia. Though early colonies struggled or failed, the dream of New World lands stayed alive. The English imagination stretched outward, fueled by the idea that God and destiny favored them. Elizabeth's reign also shaped the cultural soul of England. The age of Shakespeare and Marlowe gave the kingdom a voice that celebrated adventure, courage, and ambition. Plays and poems echoed with themes of fate, exploration, and human struggle. These works fed the same spirit that sent sailors across the seas. It was a time when words and actions together built the idea of an England ready to lead. The Queen herself embodied this spirit. Though she never married, she used diplomacy like a weapon, playing suitors and kings against each other. She ruled not through brute force, but through intelligence and adaptability. Her court became a place where ambition and loyalty were tested, where bold men sought her favour, and where the idea of England as more than just an island was nurtured. But the Elizabethan age was not without shadows. The poor in England still suffered, and poverty grew as enclosures took farmland from peasants. Religious conflict lingered, with Catholics facing suspicion and persecution. Colonization, while promising opportunity, also brought cruelty to native peoples in lands the English claimed. The very seeds of empire carried both hope and exploitation. Still, the Elizabethan era marked a turning point. Before Elizabeth, England had been a nation of survival. After her, it became a nation of ambition. Her sailors carried not only guns but also dreams. Her people believed that destiny was on their side. And her enemies, though powerful, learned to respect and fear the defiant island. The story of empire does not begin in boardrooms or parliaments. It begins with the wind in sails, the roar of cannons, and the courage of those willing to defy the odds. In Elizabeth's reign, England found its voice, its pride, and its path to empire. The Sea Dogs may have been called pirates by their enemies, but for England, they were builders of the future. When Elizabeth died in 1603, she left no direct heir, but she left a legacy greater than any crown. She left a kingdom ready to face the world, confident in its strength and eager for expansion. From the narrow harbours of her island, ships would now sail farther, carrying the flag of a nation that was no longer afraid. The age of Elizabeth had sown the seeds of empire, and in the centuries to come, those seeds would grow beyond anything she or her sailors could have imagined. The 17th century was the time when dreams began to take shape, when England's scattered attempts across the oceans slowly grew into something more permanent. What had begun as raids, adventures, and failed colonies under Elizabeth now became settlements, trade networks, and the structures of empire. It was not yet the British Empire of glory, but it was the foundation on which everything later would stand. The century was turbulent, marked by civil wars, revolutions, and struggles for power at home. Yet it was also the age when the seeds of empire began to take firm root overseas. In the early 1600s, England was still uncertain about its place in the world. Elizabeth had died in 1603, leaving the throne to James the Foreign of the Stuart line. With him came union between England and Scotland, a step toward the kingdom that would later call itself Great Britain. But unity at home did not mean peace. Religion divided the land, kings and parliaments quarrelled, and ordinary people carried the weight of taxes and hunger. Yet while politics consumed the island, across the Atlantic and in faraway seas, English ships continued to sail. One of the most important ventures of this century was the founding of Jamestown in Virginia in 1607. It was the first permanent English colony in North America. Though survival was harsh, disease, hunger, and conflict with native peoples nearly destroyed it. But tobacco became its salvation. The crop found eager buyers in Europe, and soon plantations spread along the rivers of Virginia. Tobacco meant profit, and profit meant more settlers, more ships, and more ambition. The English crown saw the potential. Colonies were not only escapes for restless people at home, but also sources of wealth for the kingdom. At the same time, Religious dissenters sought freedom across the seas. The Mayflower voyage of 1620 carried the Pilgrims to Plymouth, another fragile settlement on the coast of New England. They came not for profit, but for faith, seeking to worship without interference. Their survival through cold winters and harsh conditions became part of the English colonial story. What began as small, struggling communities of farmers and fishermen would grow into colonies that one day would demand independence. But in the 17th century, they were simply another stone in the empire's foundation. The Caribbean became even more important. Islands like Barbados, Jamaica, and others turned into centers of sugar production, a crop that demanded brutal labor. Plantations grew rich, but they depended on enslaved Africans brought across the Atlantic in terrible voyages. The slave trade became one of the darkest yet most profitable foundations of empire. English ships carried human cargo from Africa to the Americas, sugar back to Europe, and manufactured goods to Africa, creating the triangular trade. For the merchants and the crown, it was wealth beyond measure. For the enslaved, it was suffering beyond words. This contradiction, riches built on cruelty, would remain at the heart of the empire for centuries. Farther east, English traders set their sights on Asia. The East India Company, founded in 1600, expanded its reach, competing with the Portuguese and Dutch for spices, textiles, and other luxuries. Small trading posts in India grew into fortified settlements. The company's soldiers, hired for protection, slowly turned into a private army. Though still far from ruling India, the company's presence was the thin edge of a wedge that would later split empires and kingdoms. At home, the 17th century was far from peaceful. England itself was torn apart by civil war in the 1640s. King Charles III clashed with Parliament, and the nation divided between royalists and parliamentarians. The war ended with a shocking execution of the king in 1649, leaving Oliver Cromwell to rule as Lord Protector. For a time, England was a republic, but it was a republic carried forward by military strength. Even during this turmoil, the empire did not stop. Cromwell's government sent fleets to the Caribbean, seizing Jamaica from Spain in 1655. The empire was already becoming something larger than the island's own struggles. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 brought Charles came to the throne. With him came renewed interest in overseas expansion. Royal charters gave birth to companies and colonies. Trade became more organized, with laws like the Navigation Acts ensuring that English goods traveled in English ships. These acts tied the colonies closer to the crown, ensuring wealth flowed back to the island rather than to rivals. Control of seas became as important as control of land, and England grew skilled at both. The Dutch, once allies, now became rivals. England fought a series of naval wars against the Netherlands in the mid-1600s, struggling for dominance of trade routes. The wars were fierce, but they taught England valuable lessons about naval strength. By the century's end, England's navy was on its way to becoming the strongest in the world, a power that would support empire for generations. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, which replaced James II with William and Mary, reshaped politics at home. Parliament gained more authority, and the balance of power shifted. This political settlement created a more stable government, better able to support overseas ventures. It was no accident that after 1688, England's empire grew faster. A strong navy, merchant wealth, and political stability formed the three pillars on which expansion could stand. By the end of the 17th century, England had scattered colonies in North America, rich plantations in the Caribbean, trading posts in Africa, and footholds in India. It was not yet the empire of later centuries, but it had laid the groundwork. Ships carried goods and people across oceans, wealth flowed back to the island, and a sense of destiny began to grow. Ordinary Englishmen and women, once limited to their villages, now lived lives shaped by sugar from Jamaica, tobacco from Virginia, and cotton from India. The world was becoming smaller, and England was at the center of it. The 17th century was a century of struggle and foundation. At home, kings lost crowns and parliaments rose in power. Abroad, fragile colonies became permanent, trade became organized, and profits grew. The island kingdom that once fought only to survive had begun to build something larger than itself. The empire's roots were still shallow, but they were spreading fast. If there was one land that came to symbolize the wealth, the ambition, and the contradictions of the British Empire, it was India. For centuries, India had been a place of legendary riches, known in Europe for its spices, silk, jewels, and vast kingdoms. Long before Britain dreamed of empire, Traders told stories of markets overflowing with color, palaces decorated with gold, and empires like the Mughals that stretched across the subcontinent. For Europeans, India was not only a prize but a dream, and for Britain, it would become both the jewel in the crown and the greatest test of its power. The story began not with kings or armies, but with merchants. In 1600, during the reign of Elizabeth I, the East India Company was founded. It was not an empire but a business, created by royal charter to trade in the East. At first, the company seemed like a small venture, competing with the more established Portuguese and Dutch traders who already had strongholds in Asia. But what made the company unique was its mix of private ambition and royal authority. It was a business, yet it carried the blessing of the crown. It could trade, but also raise armies, build forts, and even wage war if needed. At first, the East India Company focused on spices, cloth, and precious goods. Ships sailed from London, braving months of storms and sickness to reach Indian ports. The journey was long and dangerous. Many never returned. But those that did brought home profits so large that investors and merchants poured more money into the company. In London, its headquarters grew grand, while in India, its presence expanded from small trading posts into fortified settlements. The company gained its first real footholds in places like Surat, Madras, and Bombay. These were not conquests, but agreements with local rulers who saw profit in allowing the English to trade. The Mughals, rulers of most of India at the time, tolerated the company. To them, the English seemed no great threat, just another group of foreigners eager to buy textiles and spices. But the English were patient. They built warehouses, trained guards, and fortified their ports. Slowly, without drawing too much attention, they grew stronger. As time passed, trade brought both wealth and conflict. Rivalries with the Portuguese and Dutch forced the English to defend their interests with force. Skirmishes at sea and battles over trading posts became common. The East India Company hired soldiers, both from England and from local communities in India. These men, known as sepoys, became the backbone of the company's private army. At first small, this army would one day rival the forces of kingdoms themselves. The 17th century was only the beginning. By the 18th century, the Mughal Empire began to weaken. Once mighty, it now fractured under the strain of internal conflict, regional rivals, and foreign invasions. Into this power vacuum stepped the East India Company. No longer content to simply trade, the company began to rule. At Plassey in 1757, Robert Clive led company forces to a decisive victory against the Nawab of Bengal. The battle, though small in size, changed history. With Bengal under its influence, the company gained access to immense wealth, fertile lands, bustling cities, and rich trade. The foundations of British power in India were laid. Yet even before this moment, the seeds of empire were visible. The company's officials lived in fortified compounds, carried themselves like rulers, and demanded concessions from local leaders. They brought with them not only trade goods, but also English laws, customs, and ambitions. Step by step, trade turned into governance. India, once a place of partnership, became a land of control. For Britain, India was more than profit. It became identity. The fabrics of Bengal clothed Europe. The spices of the south flavored its food. The jewels of the north dazzled its markets. Ships from India filled the coffers of London merchants, funding wars, palaces, and industries. The empire at home, still fragile in Europe, was growing strong abroad thanks to India's riches. But the story was not one of glory alone. For Indians, the East India Company's rise brought disruption. Traditional industries suffered as company demands changed markets. Farmers faced taxes and exploitation. Wealth that once enriched local courts now flowed overseas. Resistance simmered in villages and cities, though the company's armies often crushed it. The darker side of empire, exploitation and greed, revealed itself early in India. Still, the bond between Britain and India deepened. English officials began to study local languages, collect manuscripts, and record customs. Missionaries brought schools and the Bible, while administrators introduced English laws and systems. Some saw this as reform, others saw it as intrusion. The empire's double face, order and disruption, learning and arrogance, grew sharper in India than anywhere else. Looking back, the East India Company's story in the 17th century seems almost impossible. A private business, run by merchants, had built armies, fought wars, and laid the foundations for empire. It was not yet the British state, but in many ways it acted like one. Its actions would transform both Britain and India, binding them together for centuries in ways that still shape the modern world. The seeds planted by the company were unlike any others. They were seeds of power, wealth, and control, but also seeds of resentment, rebellion, and resistance. For every English official who saw India as a land of opportunity, there were millions of Indians who saw it as a land under foreign shadow. This tension would define the centuries to come. By the end of the 1600s, the East India Company had grown far beyond its first small warehouses. Its ships ruled trade routes, its forts defended its goods, and its armies were ready for battle. Britain itself was still finding its way in Europe, but overseas, in India, its empire was already taking shape. The jewel of the future was being carved piece by piece by merchants who had begun as traders and ended as rulers. The 18th century was an age of fire and smoke, when empires clashed not only on battlefields in Europe, but also across oceans and continents. For Britain, this century became the true testing ground of empire. The seeds planted in the 1600s now faced storms of war. France, Spain, and other rivals were determined to keep England from rising higher. But in war, Britain found its greatest strength. Through victory after victory, it carved out dominance over the seas and laid claim to lands that would one day make it the largest empire the world had ever known. The wars of the 18th century were not like the wars before. They were not limited to castles or small battlefields in Europe. They stretched across the Atlantic, into the Caribbean, across Africa, and deep into Asia. Colonies became battlefields and trade routes became lifelines. To win was not simply to hold ground at home, but to control oceans, colonies, and wealth abroad. Britain understood this better than most. Its survival as an island nation had always depended on the sea, and now it used that sea as a weapon. At the heart of these struggles was the rivalry with France. France was larger, richer, and long considered the cultural leader of Europe. Its armies were strong, its kings ambitious, and its colonies vast. From Canada to India, French and British interests collided. Every war fought in Europe spilled over into battles between settlers, traders, and soldiers in distant lands. It was a rivalry that would define the century and decide who would rule the world. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, was one of the first of these global conflicts. When the Spanish throne was left without a clear heir, Europe's powers scrambled to prevent France from uniting with Spain under one crown. Britain, allied with others, fought not only in Europe but also in the Americas. The war ended with Britain gaining Gibraltar and Minorca, key points that gave it control over Mediterranean trade routes. Small though these gains seemed, they showed a new pattern. Britain was building an empire not of land armies, but of strategic ports and naval supremacy. The War of Jenkins' Ear in 1739, followed by the War of Austrian Succession, again drew Britain into conflict with Spain and France. Though many battles ended without clear winners, one lesson became clear. Britain's navy was becoming its sharpest sword. Its ships, faster and better armed, could strike anywhere, protect trade, and choke enemy supplies. Every sailor, every dockyard, every cannon forged in Britain's ports was part of this growing power. But it was the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, that truly decided the fate of empire. Often called the First True World War, it was fought on every continent where European powers had influence. In Europe, armies clashed in bloody battles. In North America, known there as the French and Indian War, British colonists and soldiers fought French forces and their native allies. In India, the East India Company battled the French and local rulers for dominance. The war was vast, expensive, and brutal, but in the end, Britain emerged as the victor. The results were staggering. Britain gained Canada from France, securing dominance in North America. It took Florida from Spain, opening more of the Atlantic coast. In India, victories like Plassey and later Buxar gave the East India Company unmatched control over Bengal, one of the richest provinces. Britain's empire expanded not only in size but also in confidence. The French, once their greatest rival, were forced into retreat. Spain, though still powerful, could not match Britain's reach. For the first time, people began to see Britain as the leading world power. Yet victory came at a price. Wars cost money, and Britain's national debt soared. The government turned to taxes, including on its American colonies. Colonists who had fought alongside British soldiers during the French and Indian War now felt the burden of empire in new ways. No taxation without representation became their cry. a warning that the seeds of rebellion were being sown even as Britain celebrated triumph. The Caribbean remained a battlefield throughout the century. Sugar islands like Jamaica and Barbados were so valuable that battles raged over them as fiercely as over entire countries. These islands, worked by enslaved Africans under brutal conditions, brought enormous profits. British merchants grew rich on sugar, rum, and trade, while the suffering of millions remained hidden behind the wealth. It was a dark reality that powered empire, one that would eventually call its moral strength into question. In Africa, British forts along the coast grew stronger, tying the empire deeper into the Atlantic slave trade. Ships carried human lives across the ocean, feeding the plantations of the Americas. The profits from this trade built cities, funded wars, and expanded Britain's reach. Yet the cruelty was immense. The same empire that spoke of freedom and law was profiting from bondage and suffering. This contradiction was never far from its story. By the late 18th century, Britain stood tall among nations. Its navy was unmatched, its colonies vast, and its trade networks global. But shadows loomed. The cost of wars drained its treasury. Colonists in America grew restless under new taxes and restrictions. In India, the East India Company's growing power began to raise questions of corruption and exploitation. The very victories that made Britain great also planted the seeds of its challenges. The 18th century was an age of empire built by war. Cannons and sails, treaties and taxes, victories and losses, all shaped the British destiny. Each battle fought abroad was a step toward global power. But each victory carried burdens that would one day strain the empire. From Gibraltar to Bengal, from Canada to the Caribbean, Britain's flag flew higher than ever before. Yet, in the distance, whispers of rebellion and change could already be heard. The century closed with triumph, but also with uncertainty. Britain had defeated its rivals and claimed more land than ever, but its colonies were restless, its people taxed, and its rivals waiting for revenge. The empire was stronger than it had ever been, but it was also more fragile than it knew. By the mid-18th century, Britain seemed unshakable. It had beaten France in the 7 Years' War, gained Canada, secured Bengal in India, and extended its reach across oceans. Its navy controlled the seas, its merchants grew rich on trade, and its colonies stretched from the Caribbean to Asia. Yet it was in North America, among 13 colonies that had long considered themselves loyal subjects of the crown, that the empire would face its first great loss. The American Revolution was not only a war of independence, it was a warning that empire carried within it the seeds of rebellion. The colonies in North America had grown quickly. By the 1760s, millions of people lived from New England to Georgia. They built towns, farms, and markets. They traded timber, tobacco, furs, and fish. Though distant from London, they saw themselves as Englishmen with the rights of Englishmen. They fought in Britain's wars, they cheered its victories, and they shared its pride. Yet they also had a strong sense of independence, shaped by the vast lands around them and the daily struggles of frontier life. When the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Britain found itself deeply in debt. To maintain its empire, it needed money, and the colonies seemed a natural source. The government passed new taxes, the Stamp Act, duties on paper, glass, tea, and more. To London, these were fair contributions. To the colonists, they were a betrayal. No taxation without representation became their cry. They had no seats in Parliament, yet they were asked to pay for empire. To them, it felt like tyranny. At first, protests were peaceful. Colonists sent petitions, boycotted British goods, and debated their rights. But the mood hardened as Britain answered with troops and harsh laws. The Boston Massacre of 1770, when soldiers fired into a crowd, became a rallying cry. The Boston Tea Party of 1773, when colonists dumped tea into the harbour to protest taxes, showed open defiance. Each act deepened the divide. By 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. Farmers, tradesmen, and townsfolk, armed as militias, faced the red-coated soldiers of the Crown. The American Revolution had begun. At first, few believed the colonies could win. Britain had the strongest navy, professional armies, and vast resources. The colonists had enthusiasm but little training, little money, and few allies. Yet determination can be as powerful as cannons. Under the leadership of George Washington, the colonists fought on, using their knowledge of the land and their spirit of independence to match Britain's might. The war dragged on, costly for both sides. Britain captured cities like New York and Philadelphia, but could not crush resistance. Every victory seemed temporary. Every campaign stretched resources thin. The colonies were vast, and holding them was harder than seizing them. Meanwhile, Britain faced unrest at home, with critics in Parliament questioning the cost of war. Then came France. Humiliated in the 7 Years' War, France saw its chance for revenge. In 1778, it entered the war on the side of the Americans, bringing money, weapons, and, most importantly, its navy. Spain and the Dutch Republic followed, turning the conflict into a global struggle. Britain, once the victor of worldwide wars, now found itself isolated. The decisive moment came in 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia. Surrounded by American and French forces on land and blocked by the French fleet at sea, the British Army under General Cornwallis was forced to surrender. The news shook London. After years of fighting, the war was lost. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized the independence of the United States of America. For Britain, this was a humiliation. The empire had suffered its first great fracture. A land once seen as the crown jewel of colonization was gone. Critics at home asked if the empire itself was doomed. Enemies mocked its weakness. Yet the story was not only one of loss. The defeat forced Britain to rethink its empire. The lessons were clear. Colonies could not be treated as subjects without rights. Force alone could not hold distant peoples forever. The empire had to adapt, to find new ways of ruling that balanced control with cooperation. While the American colonies were lost, Britain turned its eyes to Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. The empire's energy shifted eastward, where India, the Caribbean, and new colonies would become its focus. For the Americans, the revolution was a new beginning. For Britain, it was both an ending and a rebirth. The empire had lost one part of its body, but in doing so, it learned how to strengthen the rest. Its navy still ruled the seas, its merchants still grew rich, and its ambitions did not fade. The empire bent, but did not break. The American Revolution showed the double edge of empire. Expansion brought wealth, but it also brought resentment. Colonies could grow loyal, but they could also grow restless. Power could inspire pride, but it could also inspire rebellion. The loss of America was not the end of the British Empire, but it was the first clear reminder that no empire, no matter how mighty, could last unchallenged. The sun still rose on Britain's empire after 1783, but it shone on different lands. The future lay not in the forests of New England, but in the ports of India, the fields of the Caribbean, and the coasts of Africa. Britain had lost one world, but it was already reaching for another. The close of the 18th century left Britain wounded by the loss of its American colonies, yet it did not collapse. Instead, in the ashes of defeat, something extraordinary took root. A revolution not of kings or generals, but of machines, steam, and coal. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain from a modest island kingdom into the workshop of the world. It gave the empire tools of power that no rival could match, and it reshaped not only Britain itself, but also the lands it ruled across the globe. The change began in fields and workshops. For centuries, cloth had been spun by hand, iron hammered in small forges, and goods carried slowly by horse and cart. But by the late 1700s, inventions like the spinning jenny, the steam engine, and the power loom changed everything. Factories rose along rivers, powered by water wheels and later by steam. Coal mines dug deep into the earth to fuel engines, while ironworks poured out rails, bridges, and ships. Smoke filled the skies over towns like Manchester, Birmingham, and Sheffield. What once were quiet villages became roaring industrial centres. This transformation gave Britain immense strength. Factories produced goods faster and cheaper than ever before. Textiles, once a luxury, became a staple of trade. Steam engines powered not only mills, but also trains and ships, shrinking distances and speeding connections. The telegraph carried messages across continents in minutes. Britain, once just another European power, now leapt ahead, fueled by industry and invention. The empire became both the supplier and the market for this industrial growth. Cotton from India and the American South fed the mills of Lancashire. Sugar and rum from the Caribbean sweetened tables in London. Tea from China and later from India became a national habit. In return, British factories exported textiles, iron goods, and machinery across the globe. Colonies were drawn deeper into a system where their resources fed British industry, and British products filled their markets. The empire was no longer only about conquest. It was about trade on a scale the world had never seen. This industrial wealth gave Britain new tools of empire. Railways were laid down in India, Africa, and the Caribbean, not for local needs, but to carry resources to ports for export. Steamships replaced sailing ships, carrying goods and soldiers across oceans faster than ever. Armies equipped with modern rifles and artillery could crush resistance more easily. Telegraph lines linked colonies to London, giving the crown control at a distance once impossible. Empire and industry became two halves of the same force, each feeding the other. At home, the Industrial Revolution changed society. Cities swelled with workers drawn from the countryside. Families crowded into smoky, polluted neighborhoods. Children worked in factories, men labored in mines, and women toiled in textile mills. Poverty and wealth stood side by side, the mansions of industrialists rising above streets filled with soot and hunger. Yet even in hardship, people felt the pulse of progress. Britain was leading the world into a new age. The empire gave ordinary people tastes of distant lands. Tea, once rare, became part of daily life. Sugar imported in vast amounts sweetened diets. Cotton cloth replaced wool as the fabric of choice. Exotic goods became familiar, shaping culture and habits. Even those who never left Britain felt connected to the empire in every sip of tea, every spoon of sugar, every garment worn. But the growth of empire through industry was not free of cruelty. The same machines that gave wealth also created suffering in colonies. Indian weavers, once renowned for fine cloth, found their markets destroyed by cheap British textiles. Farmers were pushed to grow cash crops like cotton and indigo instead of food, leading to famine when harvests failed. In Africa, the demand for resources tightened colonial control. The industrial hunger of Britain turned distant lands into suppliers, often at terrible cost to local people. Still, in the eyes of many in Britain, the Industrial Revolution proved destiny. They believed their nation was chosen to lead the world, not just by force, but by progress. Speeches spoke of bringing civilization to colonies, of spreading railways, schools, and laws. The empire was painted as a gift to the world, even as it drained wealth from others. This belief gave moral cover to expansion, turning conquest into a supposed mission. The Industrial Revolution also reshaped war. British ships of iron and steam patrolled the seas, enforcing trade routes and crushing rivals. Factories produced weapons in numbers no other nation could match. When Britain fought in the 19th century, it fought with the strength of industry behind it. The empire was not only defended but expanded by machines, steel, and coal. For rivals, the challenge was daunting. France rebuilt after its revolution and Napoleonic wars, but it could not match Britain's factories. Spain's empire faded. The Dutch clung to colonies in Asia, but their power waned. By the mid-1800s, Britain stood alone as the dominant world power. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," became reality, and industry was the reason why. Yet even in triumph, shadows grew. The factories brought wealth, but also inequality. The colonies brought resources, but also unrest. The more the empire expanded, the more fragile it became. The Industrial Revolution had given Britain tools of power greater than any before, but it had also tied its fate to faraway lands, restless peoples, and systems of exploitation that could not last forever. The growth of empire in this age was dazzling, but it carried a price. Beneath the smoke of factories and the pride of progress lay questions that would return in the centuries to come. Could an empire built on machines, trade, and distant control truly last? Or would the very speed of its rise bring about the speed of its fall? For now, Britain stood tall. Its navy ruled the seas, its factories ruled trade, and its empire stretched wider with each passing year. The Industrial Revolution had made it the most powerful nation on Earth. The foundations of global dominance were set. The age of empire had entered its golden phase, bright and unstoppable. At least so it seemed. The 19th century was the high noon of the British Empire. The wars of the 18th century had cleared away rivals. The Industrial Revolution had armed Britain with wealth and machines, and the new century opened with Britain standing alone as the world's most powerful state. The French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon shook Europe, but when the guns finally fell silent at Waterloo in 1815, Britain emerged stronger than ever. Its navy ruled the seas, its colonies stretched across continents, and its economy thrived on trade that reached every corner of the globe. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was not just a boast, it was reality. For nearly a century after Waterloo, the world experienced what historians later called the Pax Britannica, the British peace, This did not mean the world was free of wars. Britain itself fought many, but it meant that no other nation could challenge Britain's global supremacy. Its navy, unmatched in size and strength, kept trade routes open, suppressed piracy, and projected power anywhere oceans touched. Its diplomats shaped treaties, its merchants dominated markets, and its flag flew from the Caribbean to the Pacific. At home, this era gave Britain a sense of confidence and identity. London grew into the financial capital of the world, banks and markets humming with money from empire. The city became the hub where ships, railways, and telegraphs connected the globe. To walk through its streets was to see goods and people from every land: Indian textiles, Caribbean sugar, African ivory, Australian wool. The empire was not distant. It was woven into daily life. Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901, became the symbol of this age. Her long reign gave stability and pride. She was crowned Empress of India in 1876, a title that reflected how central the subcontinent had become to Britain's power. Paintings and celebrations showed her as a motherly figure, ruling over countless subjects across races and nations. To many in Britain, she was the embodiment of empire itself, firm, enduring, and grand. The empire expanded even further during this century. In Asia, the East India Company's rule gave way to direct crown control after the Great Rebellion of 1857, when Indian soldiers rose in fury against British domination. The rebellion was crushed, but it forced Britain to reorganize its rule, leading to what became known as the British Raj. Railways, schools, and telegraph lines were built. While Indian princes and elites were bound more tightly to the crown, India was called the jewel in the crown, the richest and most important part of the empire. In Africa, Britain claimed vast territories during the so-called Scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. From Egypt and Sudan in the north to South Africa in the south, British officials, merchants, and settlers planted flags, built railways, and fought wars against local kingdoms. Gold, diamonds, and other resources flowed out, while missionaries spread education and religion. To many in Britain, this expansion was a source of pride. To many in Africa, it was a story of loss, disruption, and foreign rule. In the Pacific, colonies like Australia and New Zealand grew rapidly, populated by settlers from Britain. These lands, once penal colonies or frontier outposts, became new homes where British culture and institutions flourished. To London, they were proof that the empire was not only about control, but also about transplanting its society across the world. Britain also acted as a global policeman. Its navy suppressed the Atlantic slave trade after it was outlawed, patrolling coasts and seizing slave ships. Its diplomats mediated disputes between nations, often deciding boundaries and treaties. Its presence gave the world a strange mixture of order and domination. Many saw British power as a force that kept peace, while others saw it as a heavy hand that stifled independence. The century also saw the spread of British culture. English became the language of trade, diplomacy, and education in many colonies. British schools, universities, and legal systems were introduced. Cricket, tea drinking, and parliamentary politics travelled with the empire, leaving marks that still shape countries today. The empire was not only about guns and ships. It was about habits, words, and ideas that tied the world to Britain. Yet beneath the pride of Pax Britannica lay contradictions. The empire preached civilization, but often ruled with exploitation. Famines struck India, worsened by policies that prioritized exports over food security. In Ireland, the Great Famine of the 1840s killed millions while grain was still exported. Workers in colonies and at home labored in harsh conditions, while the wealth flowed to industrialists and aristocrats. The empire's glittering surface was built on deep inequalities. Still, for much of the 19th century, Britain seemed untouchable. Its rivals were either defeated or too weak to challenge it. The United States was still growing, Germany and Italy were not yet unified, and France had suffered revolution after revolution. The balance of power tilted heavily toward London. Its merchants carried goods across oceans, its bankers financed projects worldwide, and its navy enforced its will. The British peace gave the empire confidence that its supremacy would last forever. But history has no permanence. Even as Britain reached its height, forces were rising that would one day challenge it. The growing power of the United States, the unification of Germany, unrest in colonies, and the strains of ruling a vast and diverse world. For the moment, however, The empire basked in its glory. The 19th century was a time of pride, progress, and expansion. Britain saw itself as the leader of nations, the guardian of peace, and the bearer of civilization. Its power touched every shore, its culture spread far and wide, and its economy thrived on the riches of global trade. Pax Britannica was the golden hour of empire, when the sun truly never set on British lands. But golden hours do not last. Behind the calm of Pax Britannica lay storms waiting to break. The empire was vast but also stretched thin. Its rule was celebrated but also resented. Its wealth was great but also fragile. The century closed with Britain still at the top of the world, but shadows were already lengthening. The next age would test whether this peace was real strength or only a moment before decline. What was it like to live inside the British Empire during its height? To answer this, we must imagine the daily rhythms not just in London or Manchester, but in Calcutta, Kingston, Cairo, Cape Town, Sydney, and countless other places where the empire left its mark. Life in the empire was never one thing. It was many lives bound together by trade, law, language, and force. Some saw opportunity, others saw loss. For many, it was both at once, a world reshaped by power that reached across oceans. In Britain itself, the empire was both distant and present. Distant, because most ordinary Britons never left the island. Present, because the empire filled their homes and habits. A cup of tea on a cold morning, sweetened with sugar from the Caribbean and sipped from a cup made of Chinese porcelain, was as much a part of empire as soldiers marching in India. Children in London grew up playing with toy soldiers dressed in red coats, hearing stories of brave generals and faraway lands. Newspapers told tales of explorers in Africa, wars in Asia, and trade in the Pacific. For ordinary families, empire meant cheaper goods, exotic foods, and a sense of pride that their small island ruled so much of the world. But if empire meant tea in London, it meant toil in Assam, where Indian workers harvested leaves under the watchful eyes of British overseers. It meant sugar plantations in the Caribbean, where enslaved Africans and later indentured labourers worked long hours in fields. It meant cotton farms in Egypt and India, where crops replaced food, leaving villages hungry during bad harvests. The comforts of empire in Britain were built on the labour and hardship of millions elsewhere. In India, life under the empire was a mix of continuity and change. Cities like Calcutta and Bombay became centres of trade, education, and administration. Railways linked towns, telegraphs connected provinces, and schools taught English alongside local languages. Some Indians found opportunities in the new systems, jobs in the civil service, trade partnerships, or positions in the army. Others saw only exploitation, taxes that drained villages, industries crushed by British imports, and cultural traditions sidelined by foreign rule. Life in India under the empire was complex, filled with progress and pain, hope and resentment. In Africa, life in the empire often meant upheaval. The 19th century saw new borders drawn by Europeans with little regard for the people who lived there. Tribes were split, rivals pushed together, and resources seized. Missionaries built schools and churches, while companies mined gold and diamonds. Some Africans found new chances to learn, trade, or travel, but many more faced loss of land, forced labor, and conflict. The empire in Africa was a patchwork of opportunity for a few and hardship for many. In the Caribbean, the echoes of slavery shaped life long after abolition. Freed men and women struggled to build new lives while still facing discrimination and economic control. Plantations remained central, worked now by indentured laborers from India and elsewhere. Music, religion, and culture blended into new forms, mixing African, European, and Asian influences. Empire here was lived not just in economics but in identity. People forged new communities under the weight of colonial rule. In settler colonies like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, life often resembled Britain itself. Immigrants built farms, cities, and parliaments. English law, schools, and customs were transplanted across vast lands. For settlers, it was a chance at prosperity. For indigenous peoples, it was catastrophe. Aboriginal Australians, Maori in New Zealand, and First Nations in Canada lost land, faced disease, and endured policies of control. Empire brought settlers opportunity and natives displacement, a contrast that shaped life on these continents for generations. Even in Britain, life in the empire had divisions. The wealth of empire did not flow equally. Merchants and industrialists grew rich, but factory workers in Manchester still lived in crowded slums. Dock workers in Liverpool loaded goods from colonies, but struggled to feed their families. The pride of empire coexisted with poverty at home, reminding us that the benefits of global dominance were uneven, even within the heart of Britain. Culture within the empire was deeply mixed. English became the common tongue of government and trade, but local languages survived and thrived. Religions crossed paths. Christianity spread through missionaries, but Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and countless traditions remained strong. Architecture blended styles, with Gothic churches rising beside Mughal palaces, and European town halls built in African ports. Empire produced not only political borders, but cultural crossings, where old and new met daily. For children growing up in the empire, life depended on where they were born. A British child in Manchester learned about distant colonies in schoolbooks that glorified conquest. An Indian child in Calcutta might study English literature in a colonial school, while hearing folk tales at home that spoke of resistance. A child in Jamaica grew up between the legacy of slavery and the hope of freedom. A child in Sydney learned of Britain as home, even while living thousands of miles away. Empire shaped childhood, education, and imagination across continents. Daily life also meant laws and order. Police, courts, and prisons spread with empire. Some saw this as stability, others as control. Taxes were collected, censuses taken, and documents stamped with the crown's seal. The empire reached into villages, towns, and markets, sometimes bringing structure, often bringing intrusion. Life under the empire was a constant negotiation between the rulers' systems and the ruled people's traditions. In the 19th century, empire was not just a political or economic fact. It was a lived experience. It determined what people ate, what languages they spoke, how they worked, and even how they saw themselves. It was tea and sugar, law and railways, opportunity and loss. To live in the empire was to live in a world where Britain's shadow touched every corner of life, sometimes as shelter, sometimes as weight. Looking back, life in the empire cannot be told as one story. It was millions of stories, each shaped by where a person stood in the hierarchy of power. For some, it was a ladder of opportunity. For others, it was chains of control. But for all, it was an inescapable reality. The empire was everywhere, in trade, in culture, in daily routines. It was the background against which lives unfolded, quietly or dramatically, under the rule of the crown. When we think of the British Empire at its height, we often picture its flags on distant shores, its ships ruling the seas, and its factories roaring with industry. Yet behind this vast machine stood individuals whose choices, ambitions, and characters shaped its course. Some were celebrated as visionaries, others feared as conquerors, and many remembered as both. The empire was not built only by systems and machines. It was built by men and women whose lives became threads woven into its story. At the heart of empire stood Queen Victoria. Her reign lasted more than 60 years, a span that covered the empire's greatest expansion. Though she never commanded armies or ruled colonies directly, her name became synonymous with British power. To her subjects, she symbolized stability, duty, and continuity. Portraits of her hung in schools, offices, and homes across the empire, from Canada to India. She was seen as a motherly figure, a distant yet constant presence, embodying the idea that Britain's rule was orderly and enduring. Under her watch, Britain declared itself not just a European kingdom, but a global empire. Beyond the throne, generals and admirals carried Britain's reach across continents. Men like Admiral Horatio Nelson, whose victory at Trafalgar in 1805 secured naval dominance for a century, became legends. His statue still stands in Trafalgar Square, a reminder of how much Britain owed to sea power. Nelson was not simply a tactician. He was a symbol of courage, discipline, and sacrifice, qualities Britain believed defined its empire. On land, figures like the Duke of Wellington shaped history. His defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815 ended an era of European turmoil and opened the door for British global supremacy. Wellington became a national hero, celebrated not just for victory, but for representing Britain's resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. His triumph secured a century in which Britain would rarely be challenged on the battlefield. In India, Robert Clive and later Warren Hastings played roles that were both admired and criticised. Clive's victory at Plassey in 1757 gave the East India Company control of Bengal, setting the stage for the British Raj. Hastings, as the first Governor-General, tried to bring order to a chaotic administration, blending British law with local traditions. Both men left marks still debated today. Were they builders of empire or agents of exploitation? In truth, they were both. Their decisions created the foundations of British rule in India, but also sowed seeds of resentment that would one day grow into resistance. The 19th century also produced explorers and missionaries who saw empire as a mission. David Livingstone, traveling through Africa, sought to open new lands to trade and to end the slave trade by replacing it with commerce. His journeys captured the imagination of people at home, making him a household name. Livingstone saw himself as a man of faith and progress, though his presence also paved the way for deeper colonial control. Missionaries, teachers, and doctors carried similar ideals, believing they were spreading knowledge and morality, even as they disrupted traditions and imposed foreign values. Politicians also shaped the empire's destiny. William Pitt the Younger guided Britain through the Napoleonic Wars. Later, men like Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone debated what empire should mean. Disraeli embraced expansion, famously declaring Queen Victoria Empress of India. He saw empire as glory and prestige. Gladstone, more cautious, warned against arrogance and overreach. Their arguments reflected the tension at the heart of empire. Was it a noble mission or a dangerous burden? Merchants and industrialists, though less celebrated in monuments, were equally important. Men who built railways in India, owned plantations in the Caribbean, or traded tea and opium in China were the true engines of expansion. Their pursuit of profit drove exploration, wars, and treaties. While generals won battles, it was merchants who turned those victories into lasting control. Empire was as much about counting coins as flying flags, and these men understood that well. There were also reformers who sought to soften empire's harshness. Figures like William Wilberforce campaigned tirelessly to end the slave trade, and later, slavery itself, within the empire. His efforts showed that even within Britain, voices rose against exploitation. Schools were built, laws reformed, and steps taken toward what some saw as a more humane empire. Yet even these reforms often carried the assumption that Britain had the right to rule, only more gently. Great leaders of empire were not only found in Britain. In the colonies, local rulers allied with Britain to strengthen their own positions. Indian princes, African chiefs, and Middle Eastern leaders often cooperated, seeing in the empire a chance to protect their power or gain new wealth. They too became part of the story, showing how empire was not only imposed, but also shaped through negotiation and partnership. The builders of empire were many: queens and generals, politicians and merchants, explorers and missionaries. Each believed, in different ways, that they were serving a greater purpose. Some sought glory, others profit, others faith or progress. Together, their efforts created a structure that spanned continents, yet their legacies were complex. Nelson's victory brought peace but also endless wars at sea. Clive's triumph enriched Britain, but impoverished millions. Livingstone's journeys inspired hope, but opened doors to conquest. Wilberforce ended one form of bondage, while others continued under new names. Life in the empire was shaped by these individuals, their decisions rippling across millions of lives. To walk through London in the 19th century was to see their influence in monuments, speeches, and pride. To live in India, Africa, or the Caribbean was to feel their choices in laws, taxes, and armies. The empire was not an abstract idea. It was the sum of human actions, choices made in boardrooms, palaces, and battlefields. Looking back, it is clear that the British Empire did not rise by accident. It rose because men and women in positions of power believed in it, fought for it, and built it piece by piece. Some are remembered as heroes, others as villains, many as both. Their lives remind us that empires are not faceless machines. They are human creations with all the ambition, pride, mistakes, and contradictions that humanity carries. For all its glory, the British Empire carried within it shadows that were as vast as its reach. Behind the speeches of progress and civilization lay stories of exploitation, cruelty, and suffering. The empire spoke of law, order, and advancement, but for millions across its lands, empire meant loss of land, freedom, dignity, and sometimes life itself. To understand the full story of Britain's rise, we must look not only at its triumphs, but at its darkest corners. One of the deepest wounds was slavery. By the 18th century, Britain was the largest trader in enslaved Africans. carrying millions across the Atlantic in ships where disease and death were constant companions. Families were torn apart, lives reduced to chains, and generations lived and died in bondage. The sugar that sweetened tea in Britain was harvested by men and women who had no freedom, whose backs bore the marks of whips. Even after the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in the 1830s, the scars remained. Freed people in the Caribbean and elsewhere still face poverty, discrimination, and systems designed to keep them dependent. Exploitation continued in new forms. In India, the empire drained resources to feed its industries. Farmers were often forced to grow cash crops like indigo and cotton instead of food. When harvests failed, famine followed. In the late 19th century, millions died in India during famines worsened by British policies that prioritized exports over relief. To Britain, trade numbers rose. To Indian families, empty plates and graves told another story. Opium became another dark chapter. In the 19th century, Britain used opium grown in India to trade with China, forcing open markets in what became the Opium Wars. The addiction crisis that followed devastated Chinese society, while Britain defended its right to sell the drug with gunboats. The empire that preached morality at home fueled despair abroad when profit demanded it. In Africa, conquest often meant violence. During the so-called Scramble for Africa, British forces fought wars against kingdoms like the Zulu and the Ashanti. Modern rifles and artillery crushed traditional armies. Lands were seized, and resources like gold and diamonds were extracted for British markets. Africans who resisted were met with brutal force. Entire communities were displaced, their cultures undermined, their autonomy stripped away. Even in places where Britain claimed to bring law and education, the balance of power was cruelly uneven. Colonial laws often treated local people as second-class subjects. Justice favored the rulers, not the ruled. Taxes were imposed without choice, sometimes collected in ways that humiliated entire communities. Schools taught English and British values, while local traditions were dismissed as backward. Missionaries spoke of salvation, but often insulted the faiths that had guided people for centuries. The empire also left scars at home. The wealth of colonies enriched elites and industrialists, but working-class families in Britain often saw little benefit. Children worked long hours in factories that produced goods for empire. Sailors risked their lives on long voyages for little pay. The empire's riches flowed upward, creating grand palaces and mansions, while many lived in poverty in smoky, crowded cities. Resistance to empire was often silenced with blood. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, when soldiers and civilians rose against British rule, was crushed with brutal reprisals. Villages were burned, thousands executed, and entire regions punished. The memory of that rebellion, called the First War of Independence by many Indians, remained a scar on both sides. In Ireland, revolts against British rule were met with military force, and famine in the 1840s was worsened by policies that failed to protect the poor. The contradictions of empire grew clearer with time. Britain spoke of freedom, yet denied it to many. It abolished slavery, yet created systems of labor that trapped workers in poverty. It introduced schools, yet taught superiority of one culture over others. It built railways, yet used them to carry away resources. It enforced peace, yet waged wars to protect profit. The empire's story was one of light and shadow, and the shadow was long. For those who lived under its weight, empire often meant humiliation. Farmers who lost their land, craftsmen whose trades collapsed, leaders reduced to puppets, all felt the sting of control. Children grew up learning that their own histories were less valued than the history of their rulers. Cultures rich with tradition were forced to bend under foreign power. The British Empire also created divisions that still echo today. Borders drawn in Africa split tribes and communities. Policies in India hardened divisions of class and religion. The empire's methods of rule often encouraged division, for a divided people were easier to control. These fractures did not vanish when colonies won freedom. They remained, shaping conflicts long after the empire itself fell. Looking back, the dark sides of empire remind us that power always carries a price. The wealth that built Britain's factories, ships, and palaces was taken from lands far away. The pride of empire at home was bought with pain abroad. To understand the British Empire is not to ignore its achievements, but to see clearly the cost at which they came. For millions, empire was not adventure or glory, but hunger, chains, and loss. It was a system where profit outweighed humanity, where order was enforced at the end of a rifle, and where voices of resistance were often silenced. This was the shadow behind the sun that never set, a reminder that every empire, no matter how powerful, casts darkness even as it shines. Every empire that rises high must also face struggles from its own heart. For Britain, the 19th century was not only a time of expansion and glory, but also a time when the very foundations of its empire were tested from within. These challenges came not only from colonies abroad, but also from divisions, debates, and weaknesses at home. Beneath the pride of empire, cracks appeared, and those cracks would grow wider as the years passed. At the core of Britain's strength was its economy, yet this economy carried burdens. Industrial growth created enormous wealth, but it also created deep inequality. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham roared with factories, but their workers lived in slums filled with smoke and disease. Children laboured long hours, women worked for low pay, and men endured dangerous conditions. Newspapers described the riches of empire, but workers often asked what share of those riches they would ever see. Strikes, protests, and demands for reform rose steadily. The empire might have stretched across the globe, but many at home felt powerless in their own country. Political life also grew tense. The 19th century saw demands for greater representation. The Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, and 1884 expanded voting rights, but debates raged over how far democracy should go. For the ruling elite, empire was proof of Britain's greatness. For radicals and reformers, it was often proof of injustice. Money spent abroad while poverty remained at home. Soldiers sent overseas while families starved in Ireland. Each debate in Parliament was not only about policy, but about the very meaning of empire. Ireland was perhaps the sharpest wound within the British Isles. Long under English and later British control, Ireland suffered deeply during the Great Famine of the 1840s. Potato crops failed, yet food exports continued under British oversight. Millions starved or fled, and bitterness toward London grew stronger. Calls for Irish independence gained strength, and movements like Home Rule divided politics for decades. Ireland was not a distant colony but part of the United Kingdom itself, and its unrest showed how fragile unity could be even at the empire's core. Religion and culture also fueled challenges. Missionaries and reformers promoted Christianity and English values in colonies, but many in Britain questioned whether this mission was truly moral or simply a cover for profit. Debates raged between those who saw empire as a noble duty and those who saw it as exploitation. Writers, poets, and thinkers began to question whether ruling millions without their consent could ever be just. The conscience of Britain itself was unsettled, torn between pride and doubt. The military too faced strains. Though Britain's navy remained unmatched, its armies were often stretched thin across the globe. Rebellions in India, wars in Africa, and conflicts in the Middle East demanded men and money. Every new colony added to the weight of defense. Soldiers returned home with stories of hardship and brutality, stories that did not always match the glorious images painted in newspapers. The very act of holding the empire together tested Britain's strength in ways that glory alone could not hide. Corruption within the empire also grew as a challenge. Officials in colonies often used their positions for personal gain. Merchants exploited trade laws, administrators demanded bribes, and scandals reached the ears of the public in London. The image of a fair and just empire was stained by stories of greed. Each scandal weakened trust, showing that empire was not only costly, but sometimes corrupt to its core. Nationalism, both abroad and at home, also rose. In colonies, educated elites began to demand rights. In India, newspapers and organizations grew, calling for reforms and fair treatment. In Africa, chiefs and leaders protested loss of land and resources. Even within Britain, a new sense of working-class pride and identity developed, questioning whether ordinary Britons should sacrifice for an empire that often gave them little in return. Economic competition added further pressure. While Britain remained strong, new powers were rising. Germany and the United States began to industrialize rapidly, threatening Britain's dominance in trade and production. British factories still roared, but rivals now produced steel, ships, and goods at equal or greater speed. The empire had once seemed untouchable, but by the late 19th century, it was no longer alone at the top. The weight of competition pressed harder each year. These challenges did not break the empire immediately, but they revealed its fragility. The wealth of empire was real, but so were poverty and resentment. The pride of global dominance was real, but so were doubts about justice and morality. The navy was mighty, but the army was often overstretched. Colonies provided resources, but they also bred resistance. Britain was a giant, but it was a giant with tired feet, carrying burdens it could not always bear. The story of empire in the 19th century was not only a story of outward conquest, it was also a story of inward struggle. Britain ruled half the world, but it could not escape questions from its own people. Who truly benefits from empire? What is the cost of greatness? And how long can one nation bear such a load? In time, these challenges from within would join with pressures from without, turning cracks into breaks. But even in their own age, they whispered a truth the empire often ignored. Power without justice creates unrest, and empire without balance cannot last forever. As the 19th century moved toward its close, Britain still stood tall as the most powerful empire in the world. Its flag flew from Africa to Asia, its ships patrolled the oceans, and its merchants traded in every port. Yet beneath the surface of glory, new voices were rising. These were the voices of people in the colonies, once silent, now demanding to be heard. Nationalism, the idea that a people should govern themselves, not be ruled from afar, began to spread across the empire. It was a tide no army could fully stop, and it marked the beginning of the empire's slow unraveling. In India, nationalism grew from both pain and pride. The pain came from heavy taxes, economic hardship, and the memory of the brutal suppression of the rebellion in 1857. The pride came from India's own deep history, its great civilizations, and its growing educated class. Schools and universities introduced by the British produced a new generation of Indians who spoke English, read European ideas of liberty and rights, but also looked at their own traditions with renewed respect. Men like Dadabhai Naoroji, often called the Grand Old Man of India, argued that Britain was draining India's wealth. Newspapers and meetings began to spread the idea that India should have more say in its own affairs. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, started modestly, asking for reforms, but beneath the polite petitions lay a deeper seed, the belief that India's destiny was not to be a colony forever. In Africa, nationalism took different forms, often rooted in resistance to land seizures and exploitation. The drawing of new borders by Europeans split tribes and communities, and local leaders found their authority undermined. Some resisted directly, as the Zulu under Cetshwayo or the Ashanti in West Africa. Others expressed resistance through religion, culture, and oral traditions that kept alive the idea of independence. Though many African nationalist movements would not fully bloom until the 20th century, the 19th century already carried their roots. Mission schools, railways, and colonial laws exposed people to new ideas, but also sharpened the sense that foreign rule was alien and unjust. In Ireland, long part of the United Kingdom, nationalism surged with force. The Great Famine had left deep scars, and many Irish now believed that only self-rule could save their people from neglect. The Home Rule movement demanded autonomy, and though it was resisted in London, it gathered support year after year. Secret societies, writers, and politicians all contributed to a growing national consciousness. For the British, Ireland was not a distant colony but part of their own state, and yet, nationalist demands there showed that even the heart of the Union was restless. In the Caribbean, nationalism often appeared as struggles for dignity after slavery. Freed people sought political rights, better wages, and recognition of their identity. Movements to preserve culture, music, and language became quiet acts of defiance against colonial control. Newspapers written by black leaders and community figures spoke of justice and equality. Though still small, these voices carried seeds of later independence movements. Even in settler colonies, nationalism developed, though in complex ways. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, settlers of European descent began to see themselves as distinct nations, not just distant Britons. They wanted self-government, parliaments, and local control. Britain granted many of these demands through dominion status, allowing these colonies to rule themselves in domestic matters while remaining tied to the crown. For settlers, this was progress. For indigenous peoples, however, nationalism meant something different. A struggle to preserve their identity and rights in lands now dominated by outsiders. The spread of nationalism was not only about politics, it was about imagination. Railways, telegraphs, and newspapers connected people across vast regions. Ideas of liberty, equality, and national pride spread faster than ever before. Colonized peoples looked at revolutions in America and France, at Italy and Germany uniting as nations. and asked why they too could not rule themselves. Every school built by Britain to teach English also carried seeds of dissent, for students read not only Shakespeare but also political philosophy about freedom. Religion also became a source of nationalist strength. In India, reform movements within Hinduism and Islam connected spiritual pride with political awakening. In Africa, Christianity mixed with local traditions to inspire resistance to colonial arrogance. In Ireland, Catholic identity fueled nationalist demands against Protestant-dominated British rule. The empire had often tried to use religion to divide or control, but it often gave people a shared banner under which to resist. The rise of nationalism was met with mixed responses from Britain. Some leaders dismissed it, believing that empire was too strong to be shaken by petitions or protests. Others tried to reform, granting limited self-government in hopes of calming unrest. Still others answered with repression, censoring newspapers, jailing activists, or using soldiers to crush demonstrations. But the tide could not be stopped. Nationalism was not a passing anger. It was a deep current, growing stronger each year. For ordinary people in the colonies, nationalism was often a quiet hope whispered at home, in markets, in schools, and in prayers. It was the dream that one day they would not bow to distant rulers, that their land would be theirs again. It was the belief that history had not ended with empire, but that a new chapter awaited. For Britain, nationalism was both a challenge and a warning. It showed that power carried limits, and that even the greatest empire could not rule forever without consent. By the dawn of the 20th century, nationalism was no longer just a whisper. It had become a voice, sometimes polite, sometimes loud, sometimes violent. From India to Ireland, from Africa to the Caribbean, the message was the same. The age of empire could not last forever. Britain still ruled with pride and strength, but the seeds of independence were already planted in the hearts of millions. And once planted, such seeds could not be uprooted. The summer of 1914 opened like many others, with the empire still standing proud. Britain's flag flew over a quarter of the Earth's land. Its navy was the largest the world had ever seen, and its rulers believed the empire was secure. Yet in a matter of weeks, Europe was plunged into war, and the empire was drawn into a conflict that would shake its very foundations. World War I was not only a battle of nations, it was a test of empires. For Britain, it marked the beginning of cracks that would one day grow into collapse. When the war began, Britain joined the Allies against Germany and its partners. The empire rallied with it. Soldiers from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand enlisted or were recruited, fighting in battles far from their homes. Indian sepoys marched through muddy trenches in France. African porters carried supplies across rugged terrain in East Africa. Soldiers from Australia and New Zealand landed on the beaches of Gallipoli, facing terrible losses. The empire was not just Britain, it was millions of subjects who gave blood for a war they did not start. The war was fought on a scale never seen before. Trenches stretched across France and Belgium, filled with mud, rats, and death. Machine guns, poison gas, and artillery shells created slaughter unlike any past war. In the Middle East, Britain fought the Ottoman Empire, promising independence to Arab leaders in return for support. In Africa, small campaigns drew thousands into battles that seemed far from their lives. The empire was mobilized in every corner, but the cost was enormous. Economically, the war drained Britain's wealth. It borrowed heavily from the United States, selling gold and relying on American banks to keep its war machine running. The once proud financial leader of the world became a debtor. Factories in Britain worked day and night, but shortages, rationing, and inflation affected ordinary families. Colonies sent food, raw materials, and men, but they too suffered shortages and hardship. The empire survived the war, but it was left weaker, poorer, and more dependent on others. Politically, the war changed relationships between Britain and its colonies. In India, leaders supported the war effort, hoping loyalty would bring greater self-rule. Over 1 million Indians served, many dying in Europe and the Middle East. But after the war, promises of reform fell short and frustration grew. In 1919, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar, where British troops fired on unarmed protesters, shocked the world and deepened Indian nationalism. Loyalty had been met with betrayal, and the call for independence grew louder. In Ireland, the war years fueled rebellion. In 1916, the Easter Rising declared independence from Britain. Though crushed, it inspired new determination. By the war's end, Ireland was on the path to breaking away. showing that even within the British Isles, unity was crumbling. For soldiers from Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia, the war was both sacrifice and awakening. They fought bravely, but often faced discrimination, lower pay, and poor treatment. When they returned home, they carried new ideas. They had seen Europe up close, seen the weakness of those who claimed to be superior, and they asked why they should not govern themselves. The war that was meant to prove Britain's strength instead spread the seeds of independence across its empire. The human cost of the war was staggering. Nearly 1 million soldiers from Britain and its empire were killed, millions more wounded, entire villages lost their young men. Memorials rose across the empire, but grief was universal. Families in London mourned sons just as families in Punjab or Jamaica mourned theirs. The empire was tied together by shared sacrifice, but also by shared sorrow. When the war ended in 1918, Britain stood among the victors. Germany was defeated, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and new colonies and mandates were handed to Britain under the League of Nations. On the map, the empire looked even larger than before, yet beneath the surface it was hollowed, debt weighed heavily, industries were strained, and discontent stirred in colonies. The war had given Britain more land, but it had taken away much of its strength. The illusions of invincibility were broken. The empire had survived only with help from allies, especially the United States, which emerged as a new global power. Britain was no longer the only leader of the world. Its position was still high, but now shared. The cracks were visible to all who looked closely. The First World War was often called the war to end all wars, but for the British Empire, it was the war that revealed its limits. It showed that the empire could bleed, that its power was not endless, and that its subjects were no longer content to remain silent. The war did not end the empire, but it began the slow decline. Every loss, every betrayal, every grave dug in foreign soil became part of a story that pointed toward the end. The sun still shone on the British Empire after 1918, but its light was dimmer, its shadow longer. The cracks had begun, and no peace treaty could mend them. The guns of 1918 fell silent, but the peace that followed was uneasy. Britain had won the Great War, yet victory brought little joy. The empire was larger on paper, with new mandates in the Middle East and Africa, but beneath the map's bold red lines lay weakness. Debt weighed heavily, industries struggled to recover, and unrest spread across colonies. The years between World War I and World War II were not years of calm strength, but of strain, doubt, and growing challenges that revealed how fragile the empire had become. At home, Britain faced economic hardship. Factories that had produced weapons now stood idle. Soldiers returned to find jobs scarce and wages low. Strikes erupted across coal mines, docks, and railways. The general strike of 1926 showed how deep the discontent ran. Families in industrial cities lived in poverty, while politicians debated how to manage debt and unemployment. The empire still looked strong from afar, but many Britons wondered whether the glory abroad was worth the suffering at home. In India, nationalist movements grew more determined. The massacre at Amritsar in 1919 had already shocked the nation, convincing many that reforms would never be enough. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi called for non-violent resistance, urging Indians to boycott British goods, refuse cooperation, and stand united. Millions responded, weaving homespun cloth instead of buying British textiles, marching in protests, and filling jails. Each campaign of resistance made it clearer that India could not be held forever by force. The jewel of the crown had become the center of rebellion. In the Middle East, Britain inherited territories from the defeated Ottoman Empire. Palestine, Iraq, and others came under British mandate. Promises made during the war, promises of Arab independence, were not fulfilled. Instead, new lines were drawn on maps, creating borders that ignored local realities. This fueled anger and distrust. Revolts broke out, and Britain found itself entangled in conflicts it barely understood. What seemed like expansion was, in truth, a burden that drained resources and stained Britain's reputation. In Africa, resistance simmered as well. Farmers protested unfair taxes, workers struck for better pay, and leaders began to speak of independence. Though these movements were often small and localized, they showed that colonial subjects were no longer passive. The ideas of freedom and nationalism spread slowly, but once planted, they could not be erased. Even in settler dominions, the bond with Britain changed. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa had sent soldiers in huge numbers to fight in the Great War. Their sacrifice gave them a stronger sense of identity. Many felt they were no longer just colonies, but nations in their own right. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 recognised this, granting them greater independence within the Commonwealth. For Britain, this was both a relief and a loss. Allies still tied by loyalty, yet no longer under strict control. The global economy added more pressure. The Great Depression of the 1930s hit Britain and its empire hard. Trade collapsed, unemployment rose, and hunger spread. In colonies, falling prices for crops like cotton, tea, and sugar deepened poverty. Many began to question why they should suffer for a system that seemed to benefit Britain more than themselves. Empire, once a source of pride, now looked like a chain dragging people down. Politically, Britain faced rising challenges abroad. Germany, defeated in the Great War, rebuilt under Adolf Hitler with dangerous speed. Italy, under Mussolini, sought its own empire in Africa. Japan expanded in Asia, threatening British possessions there. The balance of power was shifting, and Britain no longer had the wealth or confidence to stand alone as it once had. Its navy was still strong, but its resources were stretched thin across too many fronts. At home, debates about empire grew sharper. Some politicians argued it was a burden Britain could no longer afford. Others clung to it as the only source of pride left in hard times. Writers and thinkers questioned the morality of ruling millions without their consent. Students and workers protested, while newspapers carried stories of colonial unrest. The empire was no longer seen as untouchable. It was increasingly viewed as uncertain. For ordinary people across the empire, life between the wars was a mixture of hope and frustration. In India, mass movements showed that independence was possible, yet British soldiers still stood ready to enforce control. In Africa, small victories in education and politics hinted at future change, yet exploitation continued. In the Middle East, dreams of freedom clashed with the reality of mandates. In Britain itself, working-class families lived with unemployment, while elites still spoke proudly of empire. The years between the wars were years of warning. They showed that the empire was not eternal, that its foundations were weaker than they appeared. The loyalty of colonies was shaken, the economy was fragile, and new powers were rising. The empire still covered the globe, but it no longer commanded unquestioned respect or fear. It was a giant that walked heavily but carried wounds inside. When war came again in 1939, these wounds would be torn open. But even before the Second Great Conflict, the cracks were plain for all who cared to look. The British Empire was still vast, still proud, but already on the path toward decline. When the Second World War began in 1939, the British Empire still stretched across the globe. On maps, the Red of Empire covered a quarter of the earth, and many believed its reach would last forever. But the war that followed would test every part of its strength. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, Britain would stand among the victors, but it would no longer stand as the unchallenged ruler of the world. The war broke not only armies and cities, but also the foundations of empire itself. The war began with the rise of Germany under Adolf Hitler, whose armies marched across Europe with terrifying speed. France, Britain's old ally, fell in 1940, leaving Britain to face the storm alone. The Battle of Britain, fought in the skies over London and other cities, became a symbol of courage, but it also revealed how close Britain came to collapse. Bombs fell nightly, homes were destroyed, and thousands lost their lives. The empire stood by Britain, sending soldiers, supplies, and loyalty, but the cost was immense. From the start, the war was global. In North Africa, British and Commonwealth forces fought German and Italian troops in deserts where heat and dust made life as dangerous as bullets. In the Middle East, oil fields became strategic prizes, drawing armies into battles far from Europe. In Asia, the empire faced an even greater shock when Japan entered the war. The fall of Singapore in 1942, once considered an impregnable fortress, stunned the world. Thousands of British and colonial soldiers were captured, and the myth of British invincibility was shattered. In India, the war brought both sacrifice and opportunity. Millions of Indians joined the British Army, fighting in North Africa, Europe, and Asia. They fought bravely, but many at home questioned why Indians should die for an empire that denied them freedom. The Quit India movement of 1942 called for immediate independence, leading to mass arrests and protests. Britain depended on India's resources, yet at the same time faced the reality that India could no longer be ruled as before. The war effort drained Britain's economy. Factories worked day and night to produce tanks, planes, and weapons, but much of this production depended on loans from the United States. Britain sold its gold reserves, mortgaged its future, and became financially dependent on its ally across the Atlantic. The United States, once a colony, was now the stronger partner, and Britain knew it. For people in colonies, the war was a time of hardship. Food shortages, rationing, and forced labor were common. In Bengal, famine struck in 1943, killing millions. While Britain fought to save Europe, people in India starved. In Africa, thousands were recruited to serve as soldiers and porters, carrying supplies across jungles and deserts. They returned home with new ideas, asking why they should remain subjects after shedding blood for an empire that treated them as lesser. The war also revealed the limits of empire's control. Resistance movements grew stronger. In Burma, nationalist leaders allied with Japan before switching sides, showing that loyalty to Britain was fragile. In the Middle East, promises of independence clashed with reality. In Palestine, tensions deepened between Jews and Arabs under British rule. Everywhere, the old balance was shifting. When victory came in 1945, Britain celebrated, but the celebration was shadowed. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the new superpowers, dividing the world between them. Britain, though still respected, was no longer first among nations. Its economy was shattered, its debts enormous, its people weary. The empire that had once ruled the seas now depended on American aid to rebuild. For colonies, the war was a turning point. Soldiers who had fought in Europe and Asia returned with pride, but also with questions. They had faced enemies bravely. Why should they not also face their colonial rulers? In India, independence was now unstoppable. In Africa and the Caribbean, nationalist leaders began organizing movements inspired by the promise of freedom. The war had been fought in the name of liberty, and colonized peoples demanded that liberty for themselves. World War II was the breaking point. Britain won the war, but it lost the empire's unshakable image. The fall of Singapore, the famine in Bengal, the dependence on America, the rising demands of colonies, all revealed that the empire could not continue as before. The red on the map still stretched wide, but it was fading. The war had demanded everything from Britain: its money, its soldiers, its colonies, its very survival. It had survived, but only just. Victory was real, but so was exhaustion. For the first time in centuries, Britain looked at its empire and wondered not how to expand it, but how long it could hold it together. The breaking point had come. The Second World War did not end the empire in one blow, but it cracked its course so deeply that the fall was only a matter of time. The sun still shone on Britain's empire in 1945, but it was the evening sun, casting long shadows before darkness. When the Second World War ended in 1945, Britain stood battered and broke. Its cities lay in ruins from bombing, its economy was deeply in debt, and its people were exhausted after 6 years of sacrifice. The empire that had once seemed eternal now looked fragile. Britain was still counted among the victors, but it was clear that victory had come at too high a cost. The age of empire was nearing its end, and the years that followed would see Britain retreat from lands it had once claimed as its own. The first great blow came in India. For decades, nationalism had been growing, but the war turned demand into urgency. Millions of Indians had served in the British Army, fighting bravely across continents, and yet their country remained under colonial rule. The famine of Bengal in 1943, which killed millions, deepened anger at British mismanagement. By 1947, Britain could no longer resist the pressure. India and Pakistan were granted independence, ending nearly 2 centuries of British control. Crowds filled the streets with joy, yet the partition also brought tragedy. Millions crossed borders in haste, violence erupted between communities, and countless lives were lost. The jewel in the crown of the empire was gone, and with it, the empire's core was broken. In the Middle East, independence followed quickly. Britain had ruled territories gained from the Ottoman Empire after the First World War. But now, these lands demanded freedom. Iraq gained independence, Palestine became a source of endless conflict, and other regions slipped away. Britain could no longer afford to keep control, and American and Soviet influence grew stronger in these areas. In Africa, the years after the war brought a tidal wave of change. Nationalist leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya led movements that combined peaceful protest with political action. By the 1950s and 1960s, One African nation after another gained independence. For decades, Africa had been seen as a frontier of resources and conquest. Now it became a frontier of freedom, where the old empires crumbled. Britain left, sometimes peacefully, sometimes after bloody conflict, but always because it could no longer hold on. The Caribbean too began to move towards self-rule. Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, and other islands, once centers of the sugar trade and slavery, found new voices in politics. Independence movements demanded recognition, and Britain, weary and weaker than before, often agreed. The islands moved toward independence in the 1960s and beyond, each carving its own place in the world. Even in places where settlers of European descent had long dominated, change was clear. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand had already been granted dominion status. But after the war, they grew increasingly independent in foreign policy. They remained tied to Britain through the Commonwealth, but they no longer looked to London as their master. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 had already loosened ties, and the post-war years deepened the shift. These nations were now part of Britain's family, but no longer part of its empire. The symbolic end came in 1956, during the Suez Crisis. Egypt, under President Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital waterway for global trade. Britain, alongside France and Israel, invaded to take it back. But the world had changed. The United States and the Soviet Union condemned the attack, and under heavy pressure, Britain was forced to withdraw. The humiliation was clear. The old empire could no longer act as it once had. Britain was no longer the global policeman. Its role had shifted from leader to partner, from ruler to ally. Economically, the empire's collapse was inevitable. Britain's debts to the United States were enormous. Its industries lagged behind America and Germany, and its colonies no longer accepted exploitation. The wealth that had once flowed from empire slowed to a trickle. Britain rebuilt its own society through welfare reforms, housing, and healthcare, but it could not rebuild the empire. The world economy now moved without Britain at the center. Psychologically, the loss was hard to accept. For generations, Britons had grown up believing that their empire was the greatest in history, that the sun would never set on its lands. The sudden shrinking of red on the map felt like a loss of identity. Politicians and writers spoke of decline, while some tried to find pride in the new Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of independent states that replaced the empire. Yet it was clear, the age of empire was over. For the people in former colonies, independence was both joy and struggle. Flags were raised, national anthems sung, and freedom celebrated. Yet the legacies of empire, divided borders, economic dependency, and cultural scars remained. The end of empire did not erase its impact. It left behind nations shaped by centuries of foreign rule, now tasked with building their own futures. By the 1970s, the British Empire was gone in all but name. What remained was a network of former colonies tied loosely to Britain through the Commonwealth. London was still a great city, but no longer the capital of half the world. Britain was still influential, but no longer dominant. The age of empire had passed into history, leaving behind both pride and pain. The end of the British Empire was not a single moment, but a long retreat. From India in 1947 to the Caribbean in the 1960s, from Africa in the 1950s and 60s to Hong Kong in 1997, each step marked another farewell. What had taken centuries to build unraveled in a few decades. The sun that had once never set on the empire now set for good, leaving behind twilight and memory. The empire's end was not only a political change, but also a lesson. It showed that no empire, no matter how vast, can last forever. Power rises and falls, and history moves forward. For Britain, the challenge after empire was to find a new role in the world, not as ruler, but as partner. For the world, the end of empire meant new nations, new identities, and a new chapter in human history. History often tempts us to ask, what if? What if the empire that once ruled over a quarter of the earth still existed today? Would the modern world look the same, or would it be entirely different? To imagine the British Empire alive in our own time is to imagine a global power that still held India, Africa, the Caribbean, and much of Asia. It would mean one government, one flag, and one center of decision influencing billions of lives. But it would also mean carrying forward all the contradictions, burdens, and conflicts that once defined it. If the empire survived, its sheer size would be staggering. It would include more than 2 billion people, covering lands rich in oil, gold, gas, and fertile soil. Its cities would stretch from London to Lagos, from Delhi to Kingston, from Sydney to Cape Town. English would dominate as the language of trade and politics even more than it does now. The empire would control vital sea routes, from the Suez Canal to the Strait of Malacca, and it would have military bases across every ocean. On paper, it would be the most powerful state in history. Economically, a modern empire might look like a giant network of resources and industries. African mines could fuel British factories. Indian IT hubs might be directly tied to London. Caribbean tourism might flow straight into imperial coffers. But this also reveals the problem. Would such a system truly be fair? Or would it repeat the exploitation of the past? In today's world, people demand equality, dignity, and self-rule. A British empire trying to manage so many nations would face endless protests, strikes, and revolts. Politically, the empire would be under constant strain. Modern democracy makes it difficult to imagine billions of people ruled by one parliament in London. Would Indians accept foreign rulers in the 21st century? Would Nigerians, Jamaicans, Canadians, and Australians allow their futures to be decided from across the sea? Even with technology like the internet and instant communication, the empire would find it almost impossible to balance so many voices. Unity would likely be a dream, not a reality. Culturally, the empire would be both rich and divided. Imagine the blending of food, art, music, and traditions from every corner of the globe under one banner. Festivals from India, dances from the Caribbean, and traditions from Africa would all shape the empire's culture. Yet such blending would not erase the deep memories of inequality. People would remember the scars of slavery, the pain of partition, and the hunger of famine. An empire alive today would not escape its past. It would be forced to answer for it daily. Militarily, the empire might appear unstoppable. Its armies would draw from every continent. Its navy would still patrol oceans, and its technology would likely rival the United States and China. But modern wars are not only fought with weapons, they are fought with ideas. Nationalism, human rights, and the demand for dignity are stronger today than ever before. An empire might build aircraft carriers, but it could not silence the voices of billions asking for freedom. What makes the idea of a modern British Empire most striking is how it would clash with today's values. In an age where nations guard independence, where the United Nations champions self-determination, and where people connect across borders without rulers, the empire would feel like a cage. Its existence would spark constant rebellion, endless negotiations, and likely break apart under the weight of modern demands. And yet, in a sense, parts of the empire do still exist, not in chains, but in legacy. The Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary group of countries once under British rule, continues today. Its members trade, cooperate, and share history without being forced into submission. English remains one of the world's most spoken languages. Cricket, tea, parliamentary systems, and legal traditions survive in dozens of nations. The empire ended, but its fingerprints remain across the globe. If the British Empire had survived into our century, it might seem like a superstate, more powerful than any the world has ever known. But in truth, it would likely crumble under the same pressures that ended it in the 20th century. The desire of people to be free, the refusal of nations to be ruled by others, and the reality that no empire, however vast, can last forever. The lesson of history is clear. The empire rose, it expanded, it ruled, and then it fell. If it lived today, it would not be stronger. It would be weaker, more divided, more challenged than ever before. The true strength of the modern world lies not in empires, but in nations choosing their own paths. As we look back, the thought of the empire still alive is less a vision of power and more a reminder of why it ended. Empires cannot stand forever because people cannot be ruled forever against their will. The British Empire, if it lived today, would be a giant with feet of clay, admired for its size, but doomed by its weight. In the end, the empire belongs to history, not to the present. Its story is a warning and a lesson. Greatness built on domination cannot last, but greatness built on justice and equality may endure. The British Empire no longer exists, and perhaps that is as it should be. Its rise and fall remind us not of what could be, but of what should never return.